Hello, this is the Game Dev Made Easy channel. I'm your host, Jesco, and today we are going to compare the workflows of creating a button in Unity, Unreal Engine, and CryEngine. Alright, starting off with Unity, what we're going to do is we're going to right-click to create a new button, highlight UI, click on Button. There we go. So the normal color we will keep as white. Highlighted color we will change to be a vibrant green. There we go. And press color will be a nice vibrant red. Then we'll click on play. Highlight turns green, press turns red, release turns green, clicking off turns it back white. Alright, so with Unreal Engine, let's first start off by creating a new folder, and we're going to call this one Materials. Inside this folder, we're going to create two materials, one for red and one for green. Let's go to the material editor, and the very first thing I want to do is change the material domain to user interface. Next up, I'm going to create a texture coordinate and then connect it over the final color. Over with texture coordinate, we're just going to change the value until we see the color we want. In this case, it would be red. There we go. We're going to save this, apply it, and we're basically going to do the same thing with green. User interface, texture coordinate, attach it, change the UV tiling, there we go. Save it. Or apply and save it. There we go. Go back over. Create a new folder called UI. In here, I'm going to create a user interface widget blueprint and call it button. There we go, click on button, drag it over, make it the size we want it, and I think that looks good. Save early, save often. Now, over in Appearance, if we click on Style, we'll notice Normal, Hovered, Pressed. So over on Hovered, we'll expand that, and we're going to change it to green. Then for pressed, we'll do the same thing, only click red. We'll save it, compile it, and now we'll click on Blueprints, open Level Blueprint. We'll remove the event tick, and now we can begin working on our blueprint. So the very first thing we're going to do is slide this over some. We're going to right click to pull up our all actions for the blueprint, and we're going to do widget search and create. Next up, the return value. We're going to promote this to variable, and we're going to call this button. There. Next, we're going to add to viewport. Unchecked, and there we go. We'll drag this over and this over the target. Now for the class in the construct here, we actually want that to be button. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to create another event, and this will be a mouse event actor on clicked, which is event actor on clicked. There we go. We're going to drag the variable over, and this will be a getter. And then the next thing to do is remove from parent. There we go. Drag the remove from parent over, bring that down some, and drag the button over to the target. We'll compile it, save it, and we're going to call this button UI. Save. There we go. Now, when we press play, we see the button on the screen. Highlight turns green. Press turns red. Unclick turns green again. And then not hovering turns it back white. Alright, we are finally at CryEngine. Now, CryEngine works a lot differently than Unreal Engine or Unity because there are two different ways to go about creating a UI. The first way is to use the scale form pipeline, and the second way is to use the C# UI system. Now, the C# UI system is still in the works, and it's nowhere near in comparison to the Unreal Engine or Unity versions. So I don't want to go that route, as it's not a fair comparison. So instead what we will do is we will use the scale form pipeline. So, because of that, we actually don't need the sandbox editor loaded. Instead, we will need to use something called CryEngine and Flash Develop. Now, as you can see on my screen right here, I have a folder called Giotto Workspace. I'm also going to create a folder called Flash Develop Files. This is just so you can see that the folders are completely blank, and I've done nothing with them, so you're seeing what I do in real time. Now, for CryEngine and Flash Develop, I will have a link in the description that shows where you can download them from. With that being said, let's get started with using CryEngine to create our button. The very first thing we want to do is create a brand new movie. Click on Modify, Document, and we want the dimensions to be 1280 by 720 with the frame rate of 30 frames per second. Bam. Wham bam, thank you ma'am, all done. Next up, we need to use the rectangle tool, and we're just going to create a rectangle here. I'm going to click on the rectangle inside the layer, and I'm going to call it button. Next up, I'm going to right click on it and click convert to symbol. The name, I'm going to change it to be button, and the type will be button as well. Click OK. Click on go to movie, make sure everything's saved, and then we'll double click on the button in the library here, and we'll see a layer here with up, over, down, and hit. We're only going to insert keyframes for up, over, and down. Now, first off, with up, I want it to be a grayish color. How about a light-ish gray? There we go. For over, we're going to right-click over that and then click Insert Keyframe. I'm going to change the color to be a nice, vibrant green. And for down, right-click, Insert Keyframe, and make it a nice, vibrant red. Click on Go to Movie to save it. Now, click Save As, and I'm going to save it in Giotto Workspace, and I'm going to call this Button Test. Next thing we're going to do is click on File, Export Flash Movie. It can have the name Button Test. Save. With Compressed Movie, do not check it, just click OK. All done. Now we can exit from CryEngine. Now we can open up Flash Develop. We're going to create a brand new project, and it's going to be an ActionScript 2 project, but let's make it an empty project. And I'm going to call this Button Test. And the location, yes, I want it to be in Flash Develop Files. Click OK. First thing we want to do is right-click On the button test, click on Properties. We want the platform to be Flash Player. I'm setting it to Flash Player 8, although you can use Flash Player 9. General output file. I'm going to call this button test injected. I'm going to save that. And it's going to be in my Flash develop files folder. There we go. Next up, we want to go over to injection, enable code injection, browse, Giotto workspace, button test the Shockwave Flash file, click apply. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a new class. I'm going to call this class button test class. Now let's zoom in here. And let's get started with actually adding our code. Alright, so the very first thing we want to do is we want to create a static variable called button test and inherits from button test class. In our public function button test class, we need to do _root dot button click dot on press is set to a function, and this function will be fs command button click pressed. Next up, we need to create a main method which will be called public static function main mc movie clip and inherits from void. And all we're going to state here is button test is set to new button test class. The last thing we need to do before, there we go, compiling is we want to right click on the button test class, click on always compile. And now we can click on project, build project, everything succeeded. And now we can click on test project. Our gray buttons here, we can highlight, it turns it green. We can click on it, turns it red, release, back green. Removing the hover turns it back gray. Excellent. But we're not done yet. Oh no. We're going to pull up the CryEngine launcher, and with the project we want, reveal it in Explorer. We're going to go into Assets, Libs, UI. We're going to go over to Giotto workspace, Flash developed files, button test, and with button test injected, we want to drag this over to copy it in. Now we want to right click File Explorer, and we need the GFX export tool. To get to it, go to where you installed CryEngine. For me, it's in my C drive, and we want to go to Tools, GFX Export. Click on the button test injected file that we copied into our libs UI folder, drag it over GFX Export, release, and it converted the SWF file into a GFX file, which is the file format that CryEngine uses. We can exit from there. Now we need to create a new folder, and this folder will be called God damn it. Now we need to create a new folder, and we're going to call it UI Elements. Make sure the U, the I, and the E in UI Elements is capitalized. Now we're going to create a brand new XML file. To do that, we're just going to create a new text document, all files as the file type, and we're going to call it tutorialbutton.xml. There we go. We can delete that new text document now. And now we can begin working on And now we can create our new XML file. So let's zoom in here so it's a little bit easier to see. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an opening and closing tag for UI elements / UI elements. I'm also going to create an opening and closing tag for UI element. UI element. Also going to create an opening and closing tag for GFX. GFX. Constraints. There we go. And then finally, underneath GFX, we're going to create one for events. There we go. So now all we got to do is just fill in the data. So for UI elements, we want to set the name to be tutorial HUD render underscore UI element. We want the name to be tutorial button render underscore lockless equals 1. For GFX, we have a file. Now, let's just double check to see what that file name was. Button test injected. So I'm just going to click on rename, copy it. And let's pull back up our XML file. Button test injected, add.gfx. Then layer is set to 0. In our constraints, we're going to add a new tag called align. Mode is going to be dynamic. Vertical align will be set to center. Horizontal align will be set to center. Scale will be set to 0. And max will be set to 0. And then add a closing tag for that. Now inside our events, we're going to create a new tag called event. Name is going to be on click. FS command will be set to button click press. And the description will be set to blank. Add the closing tag. And this is the final XML file. We are completely done with that section. We can exit from there. And now we can open up our project in the CryEngine sandbox editor. And I'm just going to open an empty level that I created earlier. There's absolutely nothing in it. And now, we're actually going to use the flow graph editor. I know, I haven't done that in this channel yet. Alright, so let's click on File, New UI Action. And I'm going to call this Button UI. I'm going to add a start node, right click, add node, UI, display, config, right click, add node, UI, display, constraints, and add node, UI, display, and display. And I'm going to do one more, which is right-click, Add Node, UI Events, Tutorial button, on-click. Now the on-click method here, that's exposed to the flow graph, this will be for if you want something to happen when someone actually clicks on the button. Now since I don't have anything set up for what's going to happen when the button's clicked, we're not going to worry about that. Now what we are going to worry about is we're going to set the game start output to be set for config. Then on set, we'll go from config, we'll go to set on constraints. And on set and constraints, we'll go to show and display. There we go. Let me just organize this a little bit better. There we go. So now, a couple last things we need to do. In element, double click on it. Click the little tab here. If tutorial button did not show up for you here in this UI element, that means your action script was not set up correctly. So you'd have to go back through and recreate that. If it does show up, just click OK. And then add it to the config, constraints, and display. Next up, for a cursor, double click on it. Put the check mark in there to activate it. Same thing with mouse events. And finally, in constraint scale. And we have our complete flow graph. Now click on File, Save All External Graphs. We can exit and then press play. And what do you know? Our lovely button has appeared. It's gray when we haven't hovered over it. When we hover over it, it turns green. When we click on it, it turns red. When we release, it turns green. And when we remove the hover, it turns gray. So as we can see, the workflows are a bit different between how Unity, Unreal Engine, and CryEngine handles creating UIs. Each one offers a variety of ways to handle it, and some of which are more involved, some of which are a lot easier to deal with. But all in all, I happen to prefer how CryEngine handles it just because it showcases the results of your own hard work. This has been Jesco with Game Dev Made Easy, and I'll see you next time.